Your eyes and your vision are under attack. Damaging blue light from the sun, your phone, your computer, your tablet, even light bulbs and car headlights is constantly bombarding you. The good news is our eyes actually already have a line of defense to counter the effects of blue light. This defense is made up of 3 pigments called carotenoids. MacuHealth with Micromicelle, the only supplement with the exclusive patent on all 3 macular carotenoids and Micromicelle technology.
Do your patients know what presbyopia is?
There are people who are afraid of the press.
Have you talked to your patients about multifocal contact lenses?
I've heard the bifocal, but not multifocal.
Exactly, not multifocal.
Do you need help with your multifocal strategy? Learn more at the conclusion of this episode. With more screen usage and indoor time, myopia, also known as nearsightedness, is increasing and getting worse in children. Now, certified eye doctors can prescribe MiSight One Day, the first and only FDA-approved soft contact lens to slow myopia progression in age-appropriate children. Visit CooperVision.com to find a Brilliant Futures certified eye doctor near you. Good morning, I'm Dr. Kerry Gelb, and welcome to Wellness 1280 on Open Your Eyes Radio. Please listen as I discuss the newest information in the world of health, nutrition, and sports every Saturday morning at 6 a.m. Central Time on AM 1280 The Patriot. Also, please share your thoughts by emailing me at drkerrygelb@gmail.com and visit my new website, wellness1280.com, where we have all guest links, Wellness 1280 info, and previous shows. Wellness is taking over the Patriot Airways for the next hour. Sit back, grab a cup of green tea, and enjoy part 2 of my interview with Dr. Robert Lufkin. So in part 1, we met with Dr. Lufkin. His book, a fantastic book, fantastic person, Lies I Taught in Medical School. But I know Dr. Lufkin, he's not lying to anybody. He's out there to try to help people. He's authored over 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers. People write these papers to help other doctors and disseminate information. Unfortunately, it takes about 17 years for the average paper to reach a doctor's office to be able to help their patients. But we're hoping with these podcasts and the books to be able to shrink that knowledge with all the information that we give each week. And people like Dr. Lufkin with his podcast and his social media. You could follow Dr. Lufkin at his go to his website, robertlufkinmd.com. His YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, his Twitch and Threads are all there. So Dr. Lufkin, thank you for coming back and joining me for part 2, week 2 of our interview.
Oh, thanks, Kerry. It's great to be here again.
I really enjoyed our conversation, and I said in the first one, talking to you is like talking to a therapist. You're so relaxing the way you talk, and you're so practical with your knowledge. I really appreciate you and appreciate your knowledge and helping us. So last time I mentioned that we were going to talk about coronary artery calcium score, and who would be better to talk to that than a radiologist? So tell me about that.
Yeah, this is an interesting test that people can have done for look at literally, as the name says, the calcium that's in the coronary arteries, which are the arteries that supply the heart, and it's done with a CT scan. And those arteries are the arteries that get clogged up when people have a heart attack. And the calcium that the scan shows in the arteries is a marker for disease. And the way it's done is it's a simple test, takes about 15 minutes, a relatively small amount of radiation through the chest, and then we measure the amount of calcium in those arteries. And you get a score based on that from 0 up into the thousands even. A 0 score means no calcium, and that's a good sign. And then each bit of disease will have calcium, at least the majority of them, all the way up to very high. And this calcium score has been correlated with risk of heart attack and as a reliable marker for heart disease. In fact, NASA, the space program, uses it on their astronauts when they're qualifying them to go into space and other things like that. The disturbing thing about the calcium score is, despite how how powerful it is and how much benefit it has. In most states in the United States, it's not covered by insurance. So uh, you have to pay out of pocket. But fortunately, it's relatively inexpensive. It can be $100 or $200, and you don't need your doctor's permission to get it. You can just call up an imaging center and say, "Hey, I want to get a coronary calcium score," and get this scan. And the interesting thing about it, it gives you an idea of what your risk is for coronary artery disease, and there's actually the amount of calcium in the general population increases with age. So you can see how you're doing relative to another 50-year-old or another 70-year-old or another 90-year-old relative to that, whether you're above or below the score. But there's one other interesting benefit for our calcium scores. We touched on statins in the last episode, and these are, of course, the ubiquitous drugs that are given to people at risk for heart disease to lower their LDL cholesterol. Well, scientific societies, including the American College of Cardiology, now recognize that a 0 calcium score is enough that patients can go off statins if they have no other risk factors for it. So if you're considering going off statins, but your doctor is giving you pushback, talk to them about a calcium score and see if that will help with the decision.
With the calcium score, what percentage? I've seen that about 20% of the score is actual calcium. So so the other 80%, does that mean it's soft plaque?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Soft plaque is the narrowing of the blood vessels, and there's an entity called soft plaque which doesn't calcify or hasn't yet calcified. So, people think, well, I have a 0 calcium score, I'm off the hook. Not necessarily. You may have soft plaque, and it's still an area of debate, what the risk is for this soft plaque, but the calcium score will not show the soft plaque. And what test can you do for that? The coronary CT angiogram, which involves more radiation and the injection of a dye, a contrast agent into vessels, can show that. We touched on that on the last episode, and that will show the narrowing from the soft plaque. But there's still a lot of controversy and debate on the added value of the extra radiation, the extra scan from this more involved CTA to show the soft plaque. For a lot of us, just getting a coronary calcium score, the basic one, showing the calcium may be enough.
And do you think that a calcium score is a better indicator of risk for heart disease than cholesterol?
Yeah, I think cholesterol, as we touched on before, is a risk factor for heart disease if we look at hazard ratios, but it's a very small risk factor. There are other things that are much more important, like triglyceride level, or how high your HDL is, or your type 2 diabetes risk, your pre-insulin, or if you're a smoker. All these things are much more significant than LDL cholesterol, and coronary calcium score the same way. As we talked about before, half of people coming in for heart attacks, or actually most people coming in for heart attacks, more than half, have a normal LDL cholesterol.
So if someone has, their triglycerides are high, their HDL is low, their hemoglobin A1C is a little bit high, within the pre-diabetic 5.7, the 6.4, but they come in and their calcium score is 0. At that point, would you say that's more important? Your risk of a heart attack is almost 0, although you still could get a heart attack. But if you change your diet and you start doing the things that we've talked about in the previous episode, you'll be in pretty good shape.
Yeah, the problem is, and the things you mentioned, the triglycerides, the HDL cholesterol, the glucose metabolism, the prediabetes, those are all markers for metabolic disease. And metabolic disease, as I talk about in the book, and this was a wake-up call for me, I wasn't aware of it, it is, in my opinion, underlying all the chronic diseases we're facing today as a root cause, all the way from obesity, diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, and even mental illness. So just because you have a 0 calcium score, if you're metabolically ill, then you may not, you may be at less of a risk for a heart attack, but that metabolic disturbance that you have can manifest as Alzheimer's disease, or can manifest as cancer, or increasing insulin resistance, increasing inflammation, or it may eventually push you over on the cardiovascular risk, because it's a continuum. You know, as we grow older, everything waxes and wanes, and we need to keep an eye on everything.
I think that's a good point, because one of the problems in the medical system is we're all siloed. The cardiologist doesn't talk to the neurologist, and the neurologist doesn't talk to the optometrist, and the optometrist doesn't talk to the internist. And we're all siloed because we're so busy. But we really need a generalist to put it all together.
Yeah, totally. And family medicine people, primary care, internal medicine to some extent have that generality, and that can help. You know, people say, well, radiology, what are you doing in metabolic health and longevity? Well, one thing the radiologist does is the radiologist looks at the coronary calcium score. They look at the brain of the patient with Alzheimer's disease. They look at the cancer all over the body. They look at the effects of diabetes. So radiology, in a sense, is one of those bridging specialties that we see many things. But that you're spot on with that silo, that problem. The specialization is so important for detailed information, but it limits us when we're dealing with chronic diseases that are driven by an underlying metabolic problem, like we're talking about, because you can easily miss it.
You know, my understanding is that if the calcium score is bad, they'll give you a statin. But my understanding also is that the calcium score still increases with a statin and aspirin, and will increase 25% a year. And that one of the things that may work is getting your vitamin D level between 50 and 70. And I don't know if you have any experience in that, if you've researched that at all, but do you know of a way to reverse the calcium score if yours is poor, to make it better, or at least stop it?
Yeah, the conventional wisdom is that the calcium score is the calcified plaque, as we talked about, sort of the scar in the vessel. And it typically doesn't reverse. And arguably the goal may not be to reverse the calcium score, but the goal is that not to have it progress. Because typically, as you mentioned, with heart disease, we're going to see a progression of 20 to 30% per year. So if you can get the progression down to 10%, that's a win. But it points out the problem of tests like calcium scores or even LDL cholesterol, is that they're not tightly tied to the disease. There's some new tests come out, like endothelial reactivity, because the endothelium and endothelial glycocalyx are at the root of vascular diseases, all the way from hypertension to, you know, in some sense, macular degeneration and Alzheimer's disease. And there's new tests that's now approved with insurance, where it has a little thermistor on each finger, and it measures how well your endothelium reacts to a blood pressure cuff.
Let's talk about another lie. Let's talk about the obesity lie. We talked a little bit about in the first segment, last week, about it, because, you know, if you look on the beach back in the 70s compared to people now, people are so heavy. You know, it's crazy. Talk to me about obesity and why we're so heavy.
Yeah, great question. I think part of it hinges on our understanding of what causes obesity. As we talked about last week, the recommendation still to this day, if people have a weight problem, they're told to exercise more and eat less. So if we look at that, first of all, we all know from experience that exercise is not a great way to lose weight. I mean, there are many health benefits of exercise, but weight loss is not one of them, for the simple reason that exercising works up an appetite and will cause you to eat more. The other one is eating less, and that assumes that a calorie is just a calorie. All calories are equal. It doesn't matter what you eat. Well, we all know that's really not true, and the reason is it's based on the metabolism of the three food groups your audience, I'm sure, knows. The essential ones, fat and protein, And then the non-essential ones, carbohydrates. The carbohydrates trigger a hormone called insulin, which causes fat to be stored. So if I eat foods that contain a lot of carbohydrates, I will store fat and gain weight. If I eat foods that contain a lot of protein and fats, I'll gain less weight because it won't be stored as fat as much in a simple way. And we all know that from experience. If I eat 2 potato chips, which are largely carbohydrates, they'll go to be stored as fat and I'll wind up eating the rest of the package. Whereas if I eat 2 hard-boiled eggs with, let's say, the same number of calories, I won't feel a compulsion to eat the rest of the package. The energy won't go to weight, won't go to fat, and I'll be satisfied.
So you're not going to eat 12 eggs.
Unless that was Cool Hand Luke.
So let's talk about another lie, the diabetes lie, which kind of goes with obesity and insulin. Insulin, tell us what insulin does to the body. People can have high insulin for 20 years before their blood sugar goes up, and insulin is just as damaging if it's high to the body as blood sugar. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, backing up just a little bit on all the chronic diseases I mentioned, they don't start when the doctor diagnoses it. When the doctor tells me I have diabetes, or when the doctor says I have Alzheimer's disease or I have cancer, these diseases start typically years to decades before the doctor diagnoses them. And if we wait until things are messed up enough to the doctor can see it, we've missed an opportunity for treatment. And that's why I'm advocating for these lifestyle changes. Start them early on in life so we can do that. But the diabetes is a perfect example. The insulin is a powerful hormone. It has many life-saving factors, but it also tells us to store fat. It also stimulates growth. It has when it's high, it has many untoward effects that drive the symptoms of diabetes, along with the high glucose. Things like you mentioned, retinal blindness, number one cause of amputations, surgical amputations, number one cause of renal failure and dialysis, and many other diseases. All the other chronic diseases I mentioned, diabetes is a huge risk factor. Alzheimer's disease, type 3 diabetes, right?
So do you think we could reverse diabetes with lifestyle?
Absolutely. And it's not my opinion. I mean, and throughout the book, I give you my opinion, but it's my opinion based on interpretation of the articles. So my advice means nothing. It's rather what I can read in the articles. And I show many peer-reviewed articles in the book that I base my judgments on. And you can show your doctor the book, and they will list the references in there. And I urge everyone to look at the original articles and make their own decisions.
There's a problem with the organizations such as the American Diabetes Association, the American Cancer Society, cardiology societies, because there's a lot of influence from industry. And you've mentioned about the American Diabetes Association and DaVita. And can you explain that whole issue, what happens with these societies? And they need money. I mean, so these big corporations have a lot of money. So it's like, why did you rob the bank? Because that's where the money is. And it's the same thing, these big corporations that make all the money, they wind up funding these companies, like these organizations, the American Diabetes Association, the American Medical Association, the different American Cancer Society. So can you tell us some stories about that? And then I want to discuss that a little bit about the problem, because where else are they going to get the money?
Right. I mean, we mentioned in the last episode about vegetable oils and how harmful seed oils are, yet the American Heart Association, which one would assume would be a reputable source for health information about heart disease, recommends vegetable oils as a heart healthy choice. Well, if you go back and look at the history, in the middle of the 20th century, the American Heart Association received a multi-million-dollar grant, which basically launched them from a company called Procter and Gamble. Procter and Gamble was the developer of Crisco oil, which was one of the original seed oils, and they have a very strong tie there. You mentioned the American Diabetic Association. They have ads on their website for recipes that recommend patients take food with sugar in the diet, which I disagree with because sugar is a carbohydrate. It spikes insulin, and their recommendation is just to cover the, quote, cover the sugar with insulin, and that doesn't work because the insulin reverses the acute effects of the sugar, but it doesn't reverse the chronic effects. But if you look on those ads, the sponsors for that particular ad is the DaVita Corporation, which is a renal dialysis company. So there are all these kind of financial ties and perverse incentives there. The thing about diabetes, and we talk about this in the book, is that diabetes, type 2 diabetes, which is the major kind, is insulin resistance, and it's taught to be a chronic progressive disease that doesn't reverse, and you just get sicker and sicker. You lose your toes, you go blind, you get a heart attack, and all these things happen down the road. And taking insulin doesn't change that. Many of these chronic diseases still occur even with great control with insulin. What they don't say is there's another option for treatment, and that is with dietary control, where you remove carbohydrates. And for the majority of patients, not all, but the majority of patients can significantly reduce their medications or get off medications altogether. And when they do that for type 2 diabetes, it's no longer a chronic progressive disease. Instead, it's under control and reversed. And this is the information that's not being made available to people.
Talk about, I'm going to say Fred Astaire from Harvard Medical School, that was recommending that people eat seed oils and control their cholesterol to prevent cardiovascular disease. And then it was found out later, I guess it was in 2016, that he was actually taking money from one of the sugar organizations.
Yeah, and we talk about that in the book. A couple people from the Harvard nutrition department, and the problem is it's not just Harvard, but our nutritional departments are basically paid for by the food industry, just like the food pyramid is funded by the food industries there. So it influences their decisions, like the medical industries funded by pharmacology education, at least. So the problem was, yeah, he took money in this and did not declare it at the time, which is a scientific conflict of interest. And the money was to downplay the role of sugar in cardiovascular disease and upplay the role of fats. So that's the message that LDL cholesterol and eating fats will kill you, but eating sugar won't. When I believe it's actually the opposite. Healthy fats are good for you, and sugar is more likely to give you a heart attack than a steak or a pat of butter.
So what can these organizations do to raise money? Because they get the easy money from, the big companies. They have the money. Where else can they get money? So that's where the problem lies.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, some organizations have, ethical boundaries. They don't take money from obvious conflicts of interest, and they can put up barriers like that, but that puts them in a major disadvantage because they receive much less money. It's not an easy solution by any means. But you go to the American Dietetic Association, which was funded or actually founded by a religious organization, or at least strong ties to a religious organization, which nothing against religion, but that organization has a strong dietary agenda, which has influenced the teaching in the American Dietetic Association. My mom would go to dietitian conferences, and they were sponsored by Coca-Cola and McDonald's. And this is the world we live in, and what could go wrong, right?
Yeah, what could go wrong? We're speaking with Dr. Robert Lufkin, Lies I Taught in Medical School. Fantastic book. I know Dr. Lufkin isn't lying to anybody. He's out there trying to help people. This is Dr. Kerry Gelb. You're listening to Wellness 1280 on Open Your Eyes Radio on AM 1280, The Patriot. And we'll be back with more information right after this short break. We'll be right back.
MacuHealth, your science-born and tested solutions for visual performance, macular degeneration, and dry eye syndrome. New products coming soon. Embrace the science.
We're back. We're speaking with Dr. Robert Lufkin, MD, Lies I Taught in Medical School. He's been very generous with his time, and he's helping us to get healthier, feel better, and talk to us about some of the things we learned in medical school or optometry school that are no longer true. So let's talk about anti-aging medicine for a little bit. I mean, that's something that I'm very interested in. And tell me about mTOR. I know most of my audience doesn't know anything about mTOR. What is it? And if we block mTOR, can we live longer?
Yeah, great question. The book, it's second to the last chapter. Its penultimate chapter is about longevity. And I didn't start out writing a longevity book, but I realized if you decrease the risk of all these chronic diseases, we're going to improve our lifespan. And mTOR is an amazing molecule. It wasn't discovered until the end of the 20th century. It's arguably the single most important signaling protein that we have. It's conserved over biology in billions of years, all the way from yeast to human beings, essentially unchanged. And it's a signal switch that signals the presence of nutrients in the environment. And if nutrients are present, tells the cell to grow, turns on inflammation. And this can be a healthy thing. When nutrients aren't present, it tells the cell to stop growing, otherwise it'll die, and then turn on healthy things like autophagy. So mTOR is a switch that goes back and forth. In a normal situation, it should be in both states throughout our lives, and that's a healthy thing. What we're finding with aging and with chronic diseases, mTOR is turned chronically onto this on state where we're bombarded by nutrients all the time. Growth mode is turned on all the time. And in the book, I show evidence why mTOR overactivation is at the root cause of metabolic disease and drives everything from type 2 diabetes to cancer to Alzheimer's disease to cardiovascular disease to mental health. And interestingly, there's a molecule that turns mTOR off called rapamycin. And not only does it work on almost all those chronic diseases in the animal model, and in some cases in humans, for which it's FDA approved now, when it's given to animals in a longevity experiment, it's the single most powerful longevity drug that's ever been discovered that works in every single animal model it's been tested on, all the way from yeast to mammals. And it results in a 10 to 20% increase in lifespan. And now it's FDA approved for humans. It's used by millions of people for other indications. But now there's a growing population of people that are taking rapamycin as a longevity or life extension drug off label.
So rapamycin has been a graft rejection medication. So talk about the difference in the dosage for graft rejection versus for somebody who's taking it for longevity.
Yeah, graft rejection, the mechanism, it suppresses the immune system, and it's a daily dose. It's arguably one of the most powerful, one of our frontline drugs for, renal transplants or other transplant rejection drugs. And it's very, very powerful for that. It's FDA approved for transplant rejection. It was the first FDA indication. So when you tell your doctor, I want to start taking rapamycin, they will run screaming from the room, because why would you want to do that? Because they conceive of it as an immunosuppressant. Well, what's been found is that on weekly doses, and in humans, Joan Manick has shown this, that it actually improves immune function in elderly people, as tested by a viral challenge, by a vaccine or other tests. And when you take this weekly dose, a single dose once a week, you get the benefits of turning mTOR down without the immune system effects of a daily dose, like in renal transplants.
And what would the weekly dose be? About 6 milligrams? Is that about right?
Yeah, and nobody really knows because it's difficult to measure mTOR directly, and the longevity effects are in humans are difficult to tell, but the dosage is based on some human experiments, again back to Joan Manick and others, and it's typically the most popular dose is about 6 to 8 milligrams once a week.
Now, mTOR builds builds protein. It's protein synthesis, and the brain, for the brain cells, muscle cells, other cells, is if you're taking a small dose like 6 milligrams a week, do you have to worry about that it's going to affect the brain cells or the muscle cells for sarcopenia? Uh, so that's,
Yeah,
what do you think
great
about that?
question, because it's typically older people that take rapamycin, and these longevity benefits in mice interestingly occur even when you give it to the mice the equivalent of 60 years of age. You start them, they actually still get the health benefits of the rapamycin. But yeah, the side effects, rapamycin has a great safety profile, and there don't appear to be significant side effects at this dosage. Certainly anything to do with the brain or sarcopenia. In fact, there's even an argument that the turning down mTOR is beneficial for muscle growth because you have autophagy and you clear out the old damaged cells. So, but the sarcopenia question has been looked at, and at least so far, taking rapamycin doesn't increase sarcopenia, which is a big deal in older patients.
And for mTOR, what are some of the good things to turn on mTOR if you want to build muscle and you're growing, a growing kid, somebody who's growing, and you want mTOR to increase? Will intensive exercise or oxygen or leucine rich proteins, will that help?
Yeah, absolutely. And all those things for a growing, you hit on it, a growing organism in youth, when your bones are growing, your brain's maturing, in adolescence, all those things, oxygen, insulin, growth factors, growth hormone, they all stimulate mTOR. But once you reach about 25 years of age or 30 years of age, things reverse. And the growth stimulation you get from mTOR being turned on actually, I believe, and many people believe, have negative consequences, and it begins to drive the chronic diseases of aging, the hyperfunction diseases.
And we talked about caloric restriction before. I don't know if it was this segment or last one, but things that could turn off, natural things that could turn off mTOR, like caloric restriction, maybe plant proteins. Can you talk about some of the natural things that turn down mTOR?
Yeah, and caloric restriction, not surprisingly, is the single most powerful lifespan extension in animal models, even more than mTOR. But the problem is, the animal has to be, it's uncomfortable to be caloric restricted for a long period of time. But if you think about it, turning down mTOR, turning down nutrients, you're simulating caloric restriction, and that's the things you mentioned: oxygen, glucose, insulin, growth factor, and then certain leucine type amino acids, certain branched chain amino acids will also stimulate mTOR. So you can get some of the effects of mTOR turning down, it's believed, with intermittent fasting, with shorter periods. Some people believe going into ketosis can affect it, although others argue, ketosis isn't the same as turning mTOR down, and that you actually have to go to, true fasting to do it. But a metabolically healthy diet and healthy lifestyle that I talk about in the book will turn mTOR down, I believe. And I take rapamycin, but I would never take rapamycin or recommend anyone taking rapamycin with the hope of, improving their health without getting their lifestyle things in order first, because there are benefits that we don't even understand about lifestyle that are going to probably outweigh the effects of rapamycin.
Thanks for sharing that you do take it. Tell us about how you feel since you started taking it. Do you feel any difference? Do you see any difference?
I've, great question. I feel great. I didn't feel any difference when I started it, but full disclosure, I was doing a lot of things. I was doing intermittent fasting, and I still do that. I changed my diet. I exercise more. So there were, so many moving points. It wasn't a controlled experiment, even of N of one. But some people notice Alan Green, as a physician in New York who has probably the largest experience, he was in his 70s and he noticed his heart function was going down. He was just getting tired. He was an old man. And he realized from the studies that one of the things that rapamycin does, and this has been shown in animal models now, it increases cardiac ejection fraction and it literally gives people more energy. So that was his motivation for taking rapamycin. And he noticed it almost immediately. He had more energy, and I don't want to misquote him on it, but he's talked about it a lot on our podcast and elsewhere.
Have you noticed any increase in energy from it yourself, or you really can't say?
Well, I have a lot of increased energy, but part of that may be from the intermittent fasting. Being in ketosis sharpens your mind because you're in hunter mode. Your vision gets better, your hearing gets better, your brain gets sharper, because those are the animals that survived. When you're in ketosis and hungry, you're going to be sharp. And those who didn't have sharp, all those things may not pass on the gene. So ketosis itself has benefits. But to answer your question, I haven't noticed anything particular about the rapamycin.
One of the things that are interesting is that insulin and glucose increase mTOR. And we talked about the dangers of insulin and glucose. So if your insulin is high, you're insulin resistant, you're going to turn up mTOR, and that may make you fatigued, I would assume.
Yeah, and the mTOR, turning up mTOR with the inflammation, it's going to turn up inflammation. It's also going to drive all those chronic diseases. So having your glucose elevated, it's going to turn on mTOR, and that's going to be a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, cancer, all the things. So they're all related at this root fundamental level. It all seems to make sense, although it's extremely complex. A friend of mine said, hey, understanding metabolism is not rocket science. It's much more complex.
A lot of people like to cheat a little bit when they eat. They may want a piece of a cookie or a cake. And I understand you could sprinkle something on, you could use in a salt shaker so you don't absorb the sugar. Tell us about that medication.
Yeah, there's a diabetes medicine, FDA approved, called acarbose, that it's interesting. The way it works is it blocks the gut absorption of carbohydrates, so slows the absorption of carbohydrates. And people are starting to use this off-label too for longevity. Well, why would they do that? Other than we know that eating carbohydrates triggers all this metabolic dysfunction and can lead to chronic diseases. But there's an interesting study that you may have talked about with your audience, the interventions testing program before, where a bunch of mice that's run by the federal government are divided in two, and then they're given one intervention, a drug, and then the other group is allowed to live. And they only live 3 years. They're mice. And so when they get rapamycin, this study showed that the ones on rapamycin live, 10, 20% longer than the ones without rapamycin. Now, if you give acarbose, the same study, there's a little bit of benefit from acarbose, so a smaller percentage effect. So acarbose has an effect on longevity. But the fascinating thing is when you combine rapamycin plus acarbose, there's an additive effect that's greater than either one individually. And this sort of surprise outcome is one of the reasons that I wouldn't trust taking any single drug without doing the lifestyle changes, because it just shows there's so much complexity going on with all these different factors and interactions with, mTOR and AMP kinase and, sirtuins, all these signaling molecules that we shouldn't be so arrogant to think we've got it figured out, that rapamycin is the way to go. Lifestyle has worked for hundreds of thousands of years. Let's start with that, and then we can add on our biohacking drugs later.
You mentioned it before, autophagy, and I didn't ask you to explain that. If you could explain that, and what's our best strategy for clearing out these senescent cells?
Yeah, senescent cells are old cells that have reached the end of their effective life, and they can have. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, they may not die, and they're called zombie cells, and some of them can make SASP, inflammatory products that we've heard about from the, the viral epidemic we had a few years ago. But these inflammatory cytokines and other things can happen from these senescent cells. So autophagy is autophagy. It's just self-eating. It's when the body begins to break down these cells, and it specifically goes to the zombie cells. It can identify the old ones, the damaged ones, and clearing them out. It keeps them from releasing the inflammatory products, but also makes room for new cells. There are certain drugs that are specifically senolytic, dasatinib as a prescription one, and then there's fisetin, quercetin that are supplements over the counter. But the interesting thing is a metabolically healthy diet with switching mTOR into this favorable location specifically activates autophagy. And autophagy was the subject of a Nobel Prize a few years ago in this century, relatively recently.
And do you take any supplement for autophagy, fisetin, like you mentioned, or do you take a Z-Pak once a year or twice a year? Supposedly that has some autophagy also. Is there anything that you particularly take for yourself?
Yeah, I'm reevaluating my nutrient supplement stack right now. I mean, I take vitamin D just because my vitamin D levels are a little low, but I'm actually in the process of kind of re-looking at things as far as, senolytics, NAD supplements, all these other things. And I don't have the answer yet, but I'm going to put it in my newsletter as soon as it comes out. So if you want to know, you can just check that out. It'll be coming out soon.
I will. I know some people are now taking the PDE5 inhibitors, the Viagra's or the Cialis, Levitra,
Yep.
very small doses for vasodilation, help decrease in Alzheimer's. And since we're talking about longevity, do you have an opinion on that? And do you take that for longevity?
I absolutely do. And it's fascinating. These drugs, block or they enhance nitric oxide production, phosphodiesterase inhibitors. And it's typically for erectile dysfunction. I mean, that's the biggest application. But if you think about it, it's working on the blood vessels, and it's all blood vessels of the body. Why would we only worry about one organ in men when this will benefit all the blood vessels? So it's actually now being used as a lot of people's longevity stack. I take it on a daily basis for that. And there's some experiments now, similar project, not the ITP hasn't shown it, but similar longevity experiments with animals showing that taking this can actually improve longevity. So it's very exciting, the use of these.
And which one do you take and how many milligrams?
I'm taking tadalafil, and it's 5 milligrams Q day.
Yeah, I understand.
This is not a recommendation. This is educational purpose only. This is not medical advice. Yeah.
That's why I'm asking specific for you. We're not giving any medical advice here. You have to see a doctor. But this is so I interviewed Kyle Gillette, who was a very bright young doctor, and he was telling me there's a 2.5 dose now.
There is. Yep.
About.
Yeah. Speaking about those.
It's over the counter?
No, not over the counter, but I'm sorry. Yeah. Pharmaceutical. But speaking about nitric oxide, there's a number of products from various companies that are supplements that can increase nitric oxide. They're beet-based products, or there's one company, N101, that Nathan Bryan works with. That's and they're tablets you can take, dissolve under your tongue, and you can get significant nitric oxide effects with those as well, without going to the root of a prescription.
Tell me a little bit about environmental toxins. I mean, people, I think, ignore environmental toxins and detoxification, and that's a very important part of our health. I've done podcasts on that. I spoke with Dr. Joe Pisano, who's an expert on environmental toxins. Tell me where that fits into your book, and what do you think about that?
It's huge, and it's an underappreciated area. You know, we can get our lifestyle completely in order with all the things. We can take all the rapamycin, carbos we want, but if we have, you know, mold in the basement, or mercury toxicity, or lead toxicity, or Lyme disease, or, you know, maybe microplastics, they're certainly, you know, raising their head. It may for some people it may be the, you know, the fabric that their clothes are made of. Instead of nylon, they're made with these other things, or maybe the Teflon on their frying pans. I think it's something that is, you know, underappreciated, and you know, it requires a lot of questioning and a longer questionnaire than many doctors can do in a routine visit. You know, you just don't have time to ask all the questions about the environmental toxins, and that's an area where conventional medicine doesn't do very well, but it can have huge consequences.
I mean, that's something that people really have to investigate. You know, people that go from doctor to doctor and they can't find an answer. Sometimes it's the environmental toxins that's bothering them. And
yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Mark Hyman has a great, from the Institute of Functional Medicine. If you Google multi-system questionnaire, MSQ questionnaire, they have an online thing that it's a bunch of questions, general questions, because many of these toxins have weird symptoms, you know, like, oh, my head aches, or my arm hurts, or I have bowel disease. But anyway, it's a list of symptoms. And if you, depending on how many you pick, it may point towards an environmental type toxin. It may not narrow it down, but at least raise the alarm bells that you need to dive in further. And you can download that online and score yourself with it.
And in the last 30 seconds, if you could just give me a little bit about the lies of Alzheimer's.
Wow. That Alzheimer's is, it's basically incurable based on beta amyloid. I think there's a lot of evidence we talk about in the book that it's multifactorial, and some things like a ketogenic diet in some patients may actually improve it. So that there is hope for Alzheimer's patients, but we need to look at other causes other than just beta amyloid.
I want to thank Dr. Robert Lufkin for joining me today. He's unbelievable, such a nice man. He wrote a great book that could help you. Run out and get his book. But Dr. Lufkin, you tell us, where can people find out more about you, get your book, and about your on your web presence?
Oh, yeah. Well, please visit me on my website is Robert Lufkin, LUFKIN, MD.com. And if you want, you can download a free sample of the book, audiobook, and a chapter of the book. And I'm also active on social media, so reach out to me there as well. I'd like to hear from you.
This is Dr. Kerry Gill. Thank you again to Dr. Robert Lufkin. Everybody stay healthy out there. I'll see you next week.
Your eyes and your vision are under attack. Damaging blue light from the sun, your phone, your computer, your tablet, even light bulbs and car headlights is constantly bombarding you. The good news is our eyes actually already have a line of defense to counter the effects of blue light. This defense is made up of 3 pigments called carotenoids. MacuHealth with Micromicelle, the only supplement with the exclusive patent on all 3 macular carotenoids and Micromicelle technology.
Fitting multifocal contact lenses presents a big opportunity to meet patient needs while growing your practice. Alcon is your partner not only with our innovative portfolio, but through e-learning. Learn to enhance your multifocal strategy today with the Alcon Experience Academy.
OIE Broadcasting is the emerging leader in social media. We use scientific entertainment to drive more patients into your office. Visit OIEBroadcasting.com and sign up today.